Welcome back to Faithfully Entrusted. Today we'll be looking at Judges 16, verses 16 through 13. And this is a very famous individual in the book of Judges, perhaps one of the most famous too, alongside Gideon, and that is Samson and his story with Delilah. Now, before I begin in the passage, I want to ask you a question as the listener. Have you ever kept doing something that you knew would hurt you, telling yourself you had it under control, right up to the moment that it cost you everything? Well, every person that's listening to this video or can hear my voice, you know that there are people who keep drinking who say, I could quit at any time I wanted to. There are women who are entertaining a relationship they know they shouldn't, thinking, I won't go any further than this, even though they know it dishonors the Lord. There are teenagers who are watching things they should never watch, and they think, well, I can quit this whenever I would like. Well, Samson goes down a very dangerous road. He is worn down in small doses, day after day after day after day, until one day the strength that he counted on from the Lord simply does not answer when he calls. Samson lived that exact pattern in Judges chapter 16. And we are susceptible to the same thing. In our passage today, we're going to see what happens when the bill for sin finally comes due. And is there any hope at that point? So let's look at this passage together. One question that I will sometimes hear from my people after 24 years of ministry and pastoring is this: has my sin used me up so completely that God has no more use for me? So I want you to think about that question as we unpack Judges 16, verses 16 through 31. All right. At this point, I'd like you to take a moment, pause the video, read the passage, because I'm not going to read it on here just due to time's sake, and then we'll come back and teach it. So go ahead and hit pause. Welcome back. All right, here we go. What did you notice? Well, there's some repeated words: soul, strength, eyes, grind. Remember, all those words are repeated. There's commands, right? Delilah's commanding him. Samson asks a final prayer. There's promises. There's a Nazarene vow here that's taken. God's answer to prayer. There's questions. Will Samson finally break? And there's a surprise at the end. God grants the prayer of a man who spent his strength on sin. Now, just for a little bit of context and background, Judges 16 closes the Samson cycle. That began back in Judges 13. The book of Judges runs in these repeating cycles here. Israel sins. God hands them over to an enemy. Israel cries out. God raises a deliverer. They get rest. And then Israel sins. God gives them over to an enemy. Israel cries out. God sends a deliverer. They get rest. Israel sins. And this is one of those cycles. Here, in this particular narrative, the people that Israel's been given over to are the Philistines. A few things about them before we move forward. The Philistines are on the coast. They're a sea-dwelling people. They're, all of them over there are kind of like distant cousins, related, but they have a superiority over the Israelites in their ironworking. So they're pretty strong there with those tribes that are in the south, because all the tribes are kind of operating independent of each other. There's no judge in the land. Gaza, which you'll see in the text, was a Philistine city surrounding and the surrounding region there. It's all part of that coastal plain area that's controlled by the Philistines during that period. They're one of those, like I said a minute ago, one of those sea-dwelling people that settled the coastal plains of Canaan and organized themselves into 5 ruling cities. And they possessed advanced military skill and technology through ironworking. Gaza sits at the southwest edge of Canaan along the Mediterranean Sea. It's a major Philistine stronghold, roughly 40 miles away from Samson's home territory in Dan. Remember, there is no ruling king at this time. Not even the Lord himself rules Israel because they keep breaking covenant. The tribes operate independently, And the Philistines exercised significant political and military dominance over Israel, particularly in the south here where he lives. The Philistines worship a god that is referenced in the text called Dagon. He is a grain and fertility god. The temple in the passage held a festival in Dagon's honor, crediting their false god with Samson's capture, rather than recognizing that the true God's sovereign hand had delivered everything that unfolded in the text. All right, so here is kind of how it textually breaks down, and then I'm going to give you more instruction application on how I would do it. But we see Samson's strength is lost through nagging temptation in verses 16 through 17. 2, we see Samson's departure from the Lord goes unnoticed, very scary, verses 18 through 20. Then we see Samson's suffering and blindness and bondage, third point there, verse 21. Samson's hope quietly renewed in verse 22. Samson's enemy mocked the Lord through Samson in verses 23 through 27. Then we see Samson's final prayer and final act, verses 28 through 30. And then finally, Samson's legacy is recorded in verse 31. This passage moves from collapse to captivity to a small, quiet turning point, and finally ends in death that accomplishes more than an entire lifetime of individual strength could ever do on its own. The author of Judges wants us, the readers, to feel the weight of verse 20 in particular, more than any other of the lines in this entire passage. Everything before it builds towards that moment, and everything after it flows from verse 20. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Verses 16 through 17. Now, if I were teaching this in a Sunday school class, I would do it this way. I like to use applicational imperative sentences, and I would say this: guard your strength against the slow erosion of nagging temptation. Guard your strength against the slow erosion of nagging temptation. Delilah presses Samson daily with her words until the text says that he grew weary to death. Today, for readers say, one of my favorite translations was the Holman Christian Standard, which they don't make anymore. They adjusted it now and make it the CBS, and I think it's a good translation. But anyway. Verse 16 in this one, 16:16, it's kind of funny the way that it says it. I think the ESV says that he was vexed to death. This translation is very helpful. It says, and because she nagged him day and night and pleaded with him until she wore him out. She wore him out, which is like a picture of a kid. Dad, can I go? Dad, can I go? Dad, can I go? Mom, can I have it? Mom, can I have it? Mom, can I have it? Until they just wear them out. Samson at this point had already survived 3 lies and 3 betrayals from the very same woman who has come to him again. Anyone that's watching this thing unfold from the outside sees exactly where this relationship is heading and where it's going. Samson couldn't see it. Or perhaps he saw it with clarity, but he didn't care any longer. I don't know which one it is. Both are bad. Sin rarely breaks an individual with one dramatic blow. It grinds you down through repetitive temptation until your guard simply gives out. The Hebrew word here for vexed or pressed, depending on the translation you're looking at, means persistent, wearing pressure. It's the same kind of pressure that water applied to a stone over years will do. His soul grew short or impatient to the point of death, that's what the text says. Language elsewhere that describes someone who can no longer endure their own life. He's like so wore out with it, just wants to die. So nagging, I guess, can be an effective tool to get what you want, but not a joyful tool for either the receiver or the listener. Proverbs 7:21 through 23 describes a young man led like an ox to the slaughter. And how is he done? How was it done there in that passage? Well, it's done through smooth, persistent words. James in 1:14 through 15 explains the pattern precisely. Desire conceives it, sin will birth it, and then sin, when it fully grows up, brings death. And that's been the pattern in his life behind the scenes. This This heart that has conceived sin and put Samson first and using his own strength for his own desires. Here is a reality biblically. Total depravity, that is, that we are totally, completely, we sin because we want to. We're conceived in sin, and we sin because it's our nature. It doesn't mean that a man sins as badly as possible every moment all the time. It means that sin has corrupted every part of a person, including their judgment, so that a man like Samson, who is gifted with supernatural strength, cannot muster ordinary strength to walk away from an obvious trap. So Samson speaks the truth to Delilah that she had wanted, that the Philistines were pushing her to get in order that she can be paid off, and we'll see that later. And then we get to verses 18 through 20, and this is probably the most terrifying sentence in the entire chapter. Delilah calls for the Philistines, said, and lords, and she lures Samson to sleep on her knees, and his head is shaved, wakes up, same taunt, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. She's done this 3 times before. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. She set the trap all 3 times. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And this is the 4th one. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. She knows. Samson rouses himself up, expecting the same exact results that he had had the previous 3 times. But it's different this time. Verse 20 states plainly that he did not know that the Lord had left him. He did not know. That single line carries significant weight, huge theological weight. Samson's strength never resided in his hair as some magical talisman. His hair symbolized the Nazirite vow, his set-apart devotion to the Lord. Once he treated that vow as disposable, cutting the hair simply made visible what had already happened in his heart. The tragedy is not that God left him. The tragedy is that Samson didn't even notice. He did not know. The Hebrew phrase here carries this sense of complete unawareness. Samson possesses no internal warning system to let him know it was gone and shut down. No check engine lights, no alarms being sound, no bells ringing in his mind and heart. Years, how did you get here? How do you get to the point where you don't recognize that you can judge clearly and that God's strength is not with you? Well, it's years of compromise. And they numbed him. Compromise after compromise after compromise numbs an individual, and they can no longer tell the difference between God's presence in God's absence. And this is where he sits. He's numb to the things of God. Hosea 7:9 describes Ephraim almost identically. He says, strangers devoured his strength. He did not know it. Gray hairs appeared on him, and he did not know it. Revelation 3:17 describes the church at Laodicea. The church at Laodicea had exceeding great wealth and self-sufficiency, and yet John describes them as wretched and poor and blind and naked, and they didn't even know it. You know, they were one of the only cities that didn't take money whenever a big earthquake came. They trusted in their riches more than they trusted God. Here is the reality. This is an important doctrine here. Persistent, unrepented sin dulls spiritual sensitivity. It's just a biblical fact. A believer can grieve the Holy Spirit's felt presence and power through ongoing compromise, and the most dangerous part of the process is that a hardened conscience stops sounding the alarm. What the Philistines do to Samson next makes the horror of verse 20 impossible to ignore. Here come the consequences. Verse 21, the wages of sin are made visible. And here's the reality. We got to reckon with the suffering that sin brings through blindness and bondage here in verse 21. The Philistines seize Samson. They gouge out his eyes, and bring him down to Gaza, their capital city, 40 miles away. Bind him with shackles and set him to grind the grain in prison. That's a task normally reserved for women who were not treated great by the Philistines, or animals, probably also not treated great by the Philistines. The animals might have been treated better than women, right? Every detail in this verse mirrors Samson's sin back at him with brutal precision. Think about this. His eyes led him to ruin in verse 14, when he demanded a Philistine wife because she looked right to him. Now those same eyes are gone. His strength, once used to break ropes, now and to hold the gates, now turns a millstone and a humiliating captivity. Sin promises pleasure and always delivers slavery. That's the way it goes. That's the way of sin. It looks good and it gives you slavery. The grinding here described likely refers to a hand, a degrading, repetitious, laborious task. The Hebrew term here for Samson's blinding, it is stark, and it's unbelievable that the man who was all strength is now in captive and in shackles. There's no comfort here in this verse to the reader. Romans 6:23 states it plainly that the wages of sin is death. Galatians 6:7 warns that a man reaps what he sows. Proverbs 5:22 describes for us that the wicked man held fast by the cords of his own sin. He's entangled and can't move because he has tangled himself up into it. Here's what we need to see. God's moral order stands firm regardless of a person's intentions or excuses. Sin carries real consequences. It's built in to its very structure, not simply as external punishment, but as a natural harvest of the seed as a person plants. Now, just when the chapter seems to offer nothing but judgment, we see a small phrase change the entire trajectory of this narrative. Verse 22. And I would say this if I were teaching it. Trust the Lord to renew hope quietly, even in defeat. Trust the Lord to renew hope quietly, even in defeat. But the hair of his head began to grow after it had been shaved. This verse contains no drama, no fanfare. It simply notes a biological fact. Hair grows back. Doesn't seem like a big deal. But the flow of the narrative here, this small detail, signals enormity. God has not finished with Samson. The vow, though broken by Samson's own hand, still belongs to God, who restores sin's destruction. Grace here often arrives like this quietly, unnoticed at first, growing in the dark while a man sits in his own consequences, or a woman sits in her own consequences. The verb here, began to grow, indicates a process starting and not yet complete. This is important. Plants hope and begin as a seed, not as a full harvest. And that's what we're seeing here, seed being planted. Lamentations 3:22-23 declare that the Lord's mercies never end, renewing when? Every morning. Psalm 51:10-12 shows David, another ruined man, asking God to restore the joy of his salvation after a devastating sin had ruined his life. Philippians 1:6 promises that God completes the work that he begins. So grace does not and never has depended on a person earning back God's favor based on good behavior. That's a lie of Satan. Grace moves towards broken sinners in the middle of devastating consequences, working to restore according to God's purposes, not according to human merit or good works or you being deserving. While hair here is growing quietly in a prison cell, the Philistines are gathering to celebrate what they believe makes a total defeat of Israel and Israel's God. That takes us to chapter 16, verse 23 through 27. And I would make the point this way, an imperative applicational point. Refuse to let the enemy's mockery of you become mockery of God. Refuse to let the enemy's mockery become a mockery of God. Here we see the mockery that mocks the wrong God. The Philistine lords gather to offer sacrifice to Dagon, their god. They credit their god with delivering their enemy into their hands. They begin Samson's taunting to entertain the crowd, they're calling out to him, making a big festival of it all, standing him between the pillars of the tower, or the temple, which hold everything up, blinded and humiliated, while roughly 3,000 people watch from the roof. The Philistines believe here they have won a theological victory, proof that Dagon overpowers the God of Israel, Yahweh. Every reader of this text knows better. You and I know better. The true God has not lost this contest. He has simply allowed Samson's sin to run its full course while quietly preparing one final act of judgment and deliverance for the people of God. Might be pointed out here, the reason that Samson has ended up here, he could have led God's people in repentance. But he didn't do that. He just kind of led people in his own strength. But here, in a moment of repentance and turning to God and crying out to him, he'll do one last act. This pagan crowd's confidence will set up their own destruction. Dagon here, as I said, functioned as a grain and possibly fish deity too, fertility deity among the Philistines, worshipped as a source of agricultural provision and military success. Psalm 2:4 pictures God laughing at the nations who set themselves against him. 1 Corinthians 1:27 describes God choosing what seems foolish and weak by the world in order to shame the wise and the strong. He uses fools for Christ like me and like Samson. No false God, no human power, no confident army. The Lord needs none of that. He'll have the final word. God remains sovereign even over moments that look on the surface like total and complete defeat. Now, standing between the pillars, blind and mocked, Samson prays the most honest prayer of his life, moving us down to verses 28. And if you're in this place, you're in a point of desperation, cry out to God, right? Samson calls out to the Lord, asking to be remembered and strengthened one final time, so that he might take vengeance for his two eyes. He braces himself against two pillars there and pushes with all of his strength, and the temple collapses, killing the Philistine lords, the crowd, and Samson himself. The text states plainly that he killed more at his death than in his entire life. That prayer contains no pretense. Samson does not claim innocence. He asks God to remember him, a man fully aware of his failure, fully aware of his squandering of his gifting that God gave him from birth. And God amazingly answers. Not because Samson deserved it, he did not deserve it, but because grace still reaches for a man who turns at the very end back to the Lord. As long as there is breath in the lungs, there is hope, and it is redeemable, beloved. He accomplishes more for Israel's deliverance than an entire 20 years of judges did before. Remember, in Hebrew here, carries this covenantal weight, an appeal to God's faithfulness to his own promise, not to Samson's merit. It's an appeal to who God is, and this is how our prayer should be framed. The phrase, "let me die with the Philistines," shows Samson's embracing of his own death at the price of the act. He knew the cost. 1 Samuel 1:11 shows Hannah dedicating Samuel before birth, a contrast to how Samson treated his own dedication. Hebrews 11:32 still lists Samson among the heroes of the faith, not because his life modeled faithfulness, but because grace at the last met him in one final act of trust. John 12:24 describes a grain of wheat that must fall into the ground and die to bear much fruit. God's grace reaches sinners at their lowest point, not because they earned restoration, but because God delights in showing mercy to those who cry out to him. The truth never excuses sin, or the Bible never excuses sin, nor does it promise everyone a dramatic final redemption. It simply reveals that the character of God, the God who hears. The chapter closes here not with celebration, but with quiet burial. Look at verse 31. And I would say this: leave a legacy that outlasts your failures. Leave a legacy that outlasts your failures. A life summarized in one sentence, right? Look at this. Samson's brothers and his father's household retrieve his body and bury him in the tomb of his father. The text notes that judges the Israel for 20 years, right? He was judged 20 years. No triumph in Ephraim closes his life like Gideon. No celebration marks his tomb. Just a quiet family burial and a simple record of years served. Samson's story ends the way many stories end. A person spends a God-given calling chasing personal appetites instead of covenantal faithfulness, and a mixture of real usefulness to God's purposes and real lasting tragedy come together in his life. The tomb here that is mentioned, was mentioned back in 13, ties the end of Samson's life to the beginning, when an angel announced his birth and set him apart before he ever drew one single breath. Ecclesiastes 12:13-14 calls every person in the end to fear God and keep his commands, since this covers the whole duty of man. Here is a beautiful reality. God can use flawed and compromised servants to accomplish real good. But the truth never removes the weight of a wasted potential or the grief of a life that could have displayed more of God's glory through faithfulness rather than a final act of desperation. So, what do we see here? God remains sovereign over Samuel's failures, Philistines' false confidence, and the final collapse of the temple. We see sin, the deceptive nature of sin. Small, repeated compromises rather than one large delusional decision. Usually when you hear about people having an affair or stealing money or whatever, there has been a series of small compromises that were made in the background years earlier that you never knew about, and you finally saw what happened. But there's grace here. God's grace moves towards Samson in the middle of these devastating consequences, symbolizing of his hair growing back as he reprioritizes his own heart. We see faith. Samson's faith in his final prayer models a faith stripped of every false confidence. He no longer trusts his strength, his charm, his reputation. He trusts in the Lord. That's all he has to trust, as he is blind and grinding. Maybe God's placed you there. You're in a rough situation, and God stripped so many of the pleasures and goods that you love away to where there's nothing left but him. But that's something that is by far more valuable. And then salvation, Samson's death, which accomplishes more than life, foreshadows a far greater deliverance still to come. One purchased not through the death of a compromised man, teetering towards trying to take vengeance, but the death of a perfect man bearing the wrath of God. Some difficult questions that arise from this text. One, did God really abandon Samson? Or does the text describe something else? Well, verse 20 states that the Lord left him. Language that is describing the withdrawal of empowering presence rather than a permanent, eternal rejection. The rest of this chapter shows God still working through Samson, which argues against the reading as final abandonment. So, not finally abandoned, but certainly temporarily. God withdrew a special, empowering, enabling ability of Samson to win against the Philistines. Samson's Nazirite calling, he abandoned that himself. Second, is Samson's final act suicide, and does the Bible condemn it? Well, Samson's death does occur in the act of accomplishing a God-ordained purpose, striking a decisive blow against Israel's oppressors, not as an act of personal escape from pain. Hebrews 11:32 lists Samson among the heroes of the faith in the hall of witnesses there, faithful in this faithful act. This passage does not function as a template for one's own life. I would probably argue that none of Samson's life should be copied because it's so flawed in so many ways. He's much more of a cautionary tale, representing a low point in the book of Judges as one of the worst judges that Israel has, and yet God saves him anyway. It functions as a record of a flawed judge using his final strength as God's granting it to accomplish a deliverance for God's people, because the work he did in collapsing that temple delivered God's people from their oppressors. Most suicides don't do that, right? People take their own life. How should a modern reader handle Samson's continual pattern of poor choices regarding women and vows? Well, Judges never presents Samson as a moral example. I said that just a minute ago. This is not somebody to imitate in his relationships, in his anger, or his personal disciplines, all lacking. The book consistently shows Israel's moral decline through Judges, and Samson represents that low point of the decline. His usefulness to God flows from grace and divine purpose, not from character. And then finally, why does God still answer the prayer of a man who spent his life pursuing sin? Now, that's a question, isn't it? Well, we should know this if we're people of grace, because God never operates on merit. Samson's prayer contains no bargaining, no claim to deserve an answer. He simply asked to be remembered. God's willingness to hear this kind of honest, humble cry sounds sort of like the thief on the cross, doesn't it? Even from a deeply compromised servant, previews for us the same grace offered to every sinner who turns to Christ. All right. What is the Christ connection here in this passage? Try to do this quickly. Well, first of all, creation. God created Samson like every one of us. He has strength, he had purpose, meant to display the glory of God. Samson's story shows what happens when a person given great gifts uses them for self rather than the giver. We have a fall. Samson's collapse pictures the fall in miniature of a man who knows the truth, knows the danger, and chooses appetite over obedience anyway, then suffers the consequences in his own choices. And it's seen clearly in this text. We see Israel, Samson's failure as a judge. It mirrors Israel's failure as a nation. So many times God raises up leaders in the Old Testament. They really just reflect spiritually where the whole nation is. God's just giving them a mirror with that political, theological leader. And in some ways still does that today. They're called to be set apart, but they've compromised, and they've worshipped all these other false gods, and they continue to do so. What about Christ here? Well, Samson dies between two pillars, right? Remember I said pushing between those two pillars. His arms are outstretched, taking down his enemies in his death, accomplishing more through his death than he could in his entire life and 20 years as a judge. And Jesus Christ hangs between two thieves, right? Arms are outstretched on the cross. And through his death, accomplishes what no life of perfect obedience by any mere man could achieve. And that is Victory over sin, victory over death, and every enemy of God's people. Every enemy of God's people. By contrast here, Jesus being the greater Samson by far, Samson dies for vengeance, guilty and flawed, taking his enemies with him. Christ dies for others, perfectly innocent, giving enemies, or taking his, and he dies not killing his own enemies, but giving his enemies a chance to have salvation. His life to save his enemies rather than destroy them. The church now carries the calling that Samson forfeited. A people set apart to the Lord, meant to display his glory and to display who God is through faithful obedience rather than compromised living with the world that surrounds us. Finally, Samson's story ends with a tomb. But Christ's story does not end in a tomb. The empty tomb of Jesus Christ guarantees that every failure that we have is covered by grace, and that one day it'll give away, and resurrected bodies and restored callings will take their place of all the failures, free from the compromises that marked Samson's entire life. This passage we've looked at today points towards the cross through the picture of a death that accomplishes a deliverance for God's people. It points towards the resurrection through the contrast between Samson's tomb, where he stayed, which still holds his broken body, and Christ's tomb, which could not hold him. It points towards grace, though the quiet regrowth of Samson's hair, evidence that God had not completely and utterly abandoned him in judgment. It points towards faith through Samson's final, stripped down, broken prayer, trusting nothing but the Lord himself. And it points towards the gospel through the shape of the whole story. A ruined man, undeserving of rescue, crying out and finding that God still hears. If you've not done that, won't you now? What prevents you? Turn to Christ in your brokenness. Hope this has been helpful for you today. Love to hear your comments. Share our page here. Share it with other people. We want to grow this channel, be a community. I want to give you two references here today since we brought up two kind of things. Remember the priority in your heart, something to help you with that. I wrote this. This is one of my favorite books that I wrote. Blessed are you. This is about living the Beatitudes. Keeping the things of Christ foremost in your heart. I'll put the link where you can pick that up on Amazon here in the description for today's episode. In addition to that, who you spend your time with as a married man or woman is critical. Grace for Two wrote this book based on excellent research on pastors and missionaries, and more importantly, 24 years of ministry experience dealing with couples, either in premarital or during marital counseling. I would commend this book to you deeply. That relationship between a man and a woman and that covenant that they give, that's the second most important covenant apart from giving your life to Christ. So your marriage is worth this investment, right? Don't choose a Samson. Don't choose a Delilah, right? Choose partners and push yourself to be as faithful as you can be to Christ. This would be a great devotion to do with each other. Great to spur each other on to good works. Hope this was helpful for you today. Look forward to seeing you next time. Have a blessed week.